Morning, Ruthe.
Good morning, Charles.
Thank you for joining me for this conversation. I've known you for a number of years now, first through a bar organization where we're both members called APAHM. But for those one or two people who may not know who you are yet, would you mind telling us who you are and what you do?
Right now, currently, Ruthe Ashley, I am retired after having practiced law for 30 years. So I started law as a 41-year-old middle-aged person. Before that, I was a nurse for 15 years. And then I went into a midlife crisis and one day saw a very popular show on television that had a black family. And that black family was really instrumental in deciding and giving me that push to become a lawyer. I saw this mom. Her name was Claire Huxtable. And she looked like she walked off the front page of Vogue magazine. She sounded like she had a double PhD in child psychology. Her house looked like it came out of the middle of House Beautiful, and she never cooked. I love that about Claire. She never cooked. She would go into the kitchen, lift up the pot, look in the pot, and say, this smells good, and then she'd eat dinner. So I thought, Claire Huxtable, you're doing something that I think was really very, very worthy at that time, because I saw a 5-minute segment of the show, and she was actually talking about a case she had in court. And I thought, oh my goodness, in my midlife crisis, foggy brain, I looked at her and I thought, look at this woman. She's a woman of color and she's a lawyer. If she can do it, I can do it too.
I remember being enraptured by that show too, and for the younger attorneys and others in the audience, that was the Cosby Show. And from my experience, there were other shows that featured African Americans, non-Caucasians, but that was the first one in my recollection that featured people in a normal way. And that's what was so unusual about that show.
Absolutely.
To me. But what was it about Claire, who portrayed a professional woman? I believe she was a litigator in her firm on the show. But what was it about that fictional story at that moment that was so decisive for you?
I had never seen before that a woman of color in media that had the role and was a lawyer, and that was a new idea to me. I'm a Filipina. All Filipino women became nurses, or if you didn't become a nurse, you became a doctor. So become a lawyer was very foreign to me, and when I saw her as a woman of color, as a lawyer, I thought, why can't I do this? Isn't this something I can do? I wanted to do something else. I wanted to be something other than a nurse, and I was teaching nursing at the time. I was a public health nurse and teaching nursing at Cal State University of Los Angeles. And I thought, why not become a lawyer? Why not use my healthcare background as a lawyer? She inspired me in a way that I never saw. It was seeing somebody that looked like me, that was brown, that was not white with blonde hair, that was doing something that I'd never thought about, who was my role model and my trailblazer for me. I'd never known a lawyer before. I'd never been around law, and I didn't know that law was possible at that time for someone like me, especially an older Filipina woman.
You've described elsewhere the importance and impact that your mother's beliefs and advice had on you personally. Would you mind telling us about that and describing what it was specifically about the value she imparted to you, the words that she used that left such an impression?
I have to smile because today is my mother's birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to my mother, if she had still been alive. And my daughter reminded me today that this is Grandma's birthday. And my mother was the source of the strength of women in our family. Just a little story that I told a few weeks ago. My mother birthed my sister in the jungles of the Philippines during the Japanese invasion and during the Bataan Death March. They were running from the Japanese in the Philippines, and they would hide in the jungles when they knew the Japanese were coming. She had my sister without making a sound. She went through her entire labor process, and she woke up my father. Can you believe this? She woke up my father to cut the umbilical cord. That's how quiet she was. That's the strength of my mother. So after the war, they immigrated to Hawaii, where I was born in Hawaii. And she used to tell me, as they were making plans to come to America for what she called the American dream, Ruthe, you get that good education. They cannot take that away from you. You must get a good education. She had an 8th grade education. My father had a 3rd grade education. So she told me that you get a good education, Ruthe. Doesn't matter where you go, what you do, but they can't take that away from you. So her words followed me. And her words inspired me. And even though she would come to the classroom and to the schoolyard, and like you, I was the only brown kid in my class, except for my sister. Later on, another Filipino came in and moved into our classroom, and there were maybe several African Americans as we moved through high school. But we were the first Filipino family in Glendale. We were the first Filipino family to actually buy real estate. So I was Americanized. My mother wanted to make sure I became an American young lady. So, but she would come to the schoolyard and she would call me standing there, "Shh, Ruthe, come here." And I would just die of embarrassment because my mother, with her strong accent and her way of calling me, was something that no other mother did. Not until I went to the Philippines and I stepped out into the airport at Manila Airport and I heard this slew of people calling each other, "Shh, shh, shh," did I recognize that this is the way it is done back home in the Philippines for my mother. And that is the way she grew up, and that was the way she did things. And it took me a little while to really understand the culture that my mother came from, because she was so intent on making sure that we were part of that American dream and that they would do everything that they could. So she is my inspiration, has always been and continues to be.
I've read in an interview you've given that that you described your experience at McGeorge as kind of an awakening with respect to your APA identity. And I think you described that period as when you realized that you weren't just a law student, but you were an Asian American law student, that you were going to be an Asian American lawyer. Can you describe what it was that led to that feeling and that belief?
Constitutional law. And I remember coming into McGeorge very fully aware that I was a woman. I'd been a public health nurse. I'd been very involved in the first family planning federally funded clinic as a public health nurse. I was very invested in women's issues, really thinking that strong women and the independence of women and the vote for women and everything else for women was very important. I didn't realize I was an Asian Pacific American woman. Korematsu was the first case that said, wow, you're talking about my people who are like me. And then when we studied the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was still valid in 1957, and I married a tall white guy in 1970, not long after that case was said not to be valid anymore. That started to affect me about how laws really can shape society, and how, after looking at myself in the mirror and thinking, wow, you are an Asian Pacific American woman, people are always going to look at you and see you because you will have brown skin and black hair, and you'll have a different look. You're not like the majority. That maybe you've got a responsibility, Ruthe. You've got a voice, you've always used it, and now you've got a responsibility to do something else other than just women's issues. Mm-hmm. You need to start making sure that it is a world of color that you are helping to advance.
I believe you graduated from McGeorge at a time, I think, when The Cosby Show was on the air, and but also when California was going through some demographic shifts, right, where California was close to becoming, if it, a majority-minority state. And we saw laws proposed in California that, to me, mirror some of the xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiment that we see nationally today. In California, we've gotten past that, and I think we've moved beyond. But
not necessarily so, but yes,
yeah.
We're trying. Yes.
Well, not necessarily so. Can you explain what you mean?
Prop 209, for instance, mm-hmm. was something that impacted us quite a bit, where we could not say anything about race and ethnicity mm-hmm. in contracts or in education. And where at the state bar, when I was on the State Bar Board of Governors, we could not say anything about diversity or race and ethnicity. When we started our law academies, we needed to stay clear of 209, so we could not say race and diversity or ethnicity, and when we were looking for creating diversity kinds of programs. So when we found our first academies, what was so wonderful about that is the legislation never said anything about race and ethnicity. It's talked about at-risk students. So it has impacted the work of diversity in so many ways, just that one law. Mm. So yeah, we think that we have overcome all the diversity issues in California. But as I was just saying earlier, it's always a constant battle. It's always a constant battle to make sure that everyone at the table has a view that a diverse leadership team or a diverse team makes better decisions, gets better results. It's been a long, long, hard road and journey on that. So yes, we've had laws that try to reduce the issues that we've had to deal with when it comes to culture, to race, to ethnicity. But we still have a long ways to go. I'm sorry, I digress. Let's go back to what you were talking about.
No, let's stick on that topic. You've described diversity work and pipeline work as one step forward, 2 steps back, and then 1 step forward, hopefully again. Departure from the usual way that phrase is used, but why does that seem like our kind of collective progress on diversity and inclusion?
One of the big reasons is because especially in the legal profession, the numbers of lawyers of color are so few. In the state of California, with, I'd say, 250,000 licensed lawyers, between 18 and 21% of us are lawyers of color. In a state that has over 60% people of color. So when you go into a courtroom and you're a defendant or a plaintiff or a party of color, you won't see too many people that look like you who are making your decisions, who understand your culture or your background. And that really begs the question, is justice being served if the people who are making judgment or who are carrying out the rules don't really understand where you've come from? So one of the big reasons that we have really focused on diversity in the legal profession is to change that paradigm, to make that paradigm a little bit more of what our population in California looks like, to make it a little bit more in the legal profession, and the lawyers who represent clients, and the judges who sit on the bench, and the people who sit in the jury, to make it a little bit more so it looks like the California that we serve. That's been a really hard job, because getting students of color to consider a profession as a lawyer is sometimes a pretty far cry from what they have come up knowing. It was for me. Mm-hmm. It was for you. And we hope that that is changing in the newer generations, and that's our job that we try to do, but I don't think it is changing. I mean, look at the numbers of Latinos and Latinas in the state of California, and the huge dissonance in the number of Latino lawyers that serve our population. It's a travesty, and it's something that we have been working on for a couple of decades. Has the needle changed? Not much, but it is starting to change in leadership. So we try to make sure that we create a leadership pipeline. And for us, we used to start in law school, but we found that wasn't soon enough. And so now we have a pathway that really starts in 9th grade. Mm-hmm. We'd love to go down to preschool and talk about before the achievement gap shows up in 4th grade. But it's a hard job, and when leadership changes, and if somebody doesn't get it, who is in the leadership of any organization, things can change overnight.
And Ruthe, one thing that I observe, you could do a lot with your career and with your time, and having switched careers mid-career, you took a more deliberate approach to how you wanted to spend your time than a lot of people do. But you've focused in your volunteer work on pipeline work like really no other person in California. I mean, I think that's fair to say. You founded the Council on Access and Fairness, the Law Academy pipeline that you created. I mean, that's really something that you gave life to. But of all the things that you could spend your time on, why have you chosen those things?
It's not an intellectual decision, believe me, it's an emotional decision. And I think each of us know when we do something what is emotionally satisfying and what brings you joy. It's really a very selfish reason, because it brings me joy and it's very emotionally satisfying. And I felt from the very first few months when I became a law student, and as you said, I discovered that I was an Asian Pacific American woman, and I had a responsibility and an opportunity to do something and to change what I hadn't found and what you hadn't found, was to create that pipeline, build those role models, build that leadership, so that those coming up behind us, they have somebody they can call. Mm-hmm. And I love it when my Law Academy student, who was in 11th grade, the 1 year that I taught Law Academy, calls me and says, "Mrs. Ashley, can you write a recommendation for me so I can get into UCLA School of Law?" Mm-hmm. Talk about having joy, sparking joy, and making someone really happy that the work that you're doing is producing results. It is changing lives. What is better than that? So this is a passion. This is a mission. This is something I do without getting one penny for it, and I love it.
Today would have been your mother's birthday, and one thing that she instilled in you is to obtain that education, because that's something that couldn't be taken away from you. If she were alive today, what do you think she would think about your work?
Oh my gosh. She took me back to the Philippines, and this is just a little taste of how she felt about what had happened in her daughter's life. Because this is one generation from an 8th grade education that she had to a law degree. And she would drag me around to all the friends and relatives. And she would say, "This is my daughter. She's an abogada. This is my daughter. She's an..." "Mom, please. You don't have to tell everybody I am a lawyer." "Well, of course I do. Of course I do." And she wouldn't stop. And I got the sense of, wow, she really is proud of what she had done. It wasn't me. I did the work in the classroom, yeah, right, but she inspired me to be who I am. And if she was alive today and she was looking down on not only me, but the lives that have been affected behind me and the lives in front of me that affected me and whose shoulders I stand on, she'd go, wow, it was worth moving to America, huh? It was worth coming across on that ship pregnant with this young lady who gave me so much trouble when she was young. I was not an easy child, I know. But she would say it was worth it. And the American dream has been fulfilled.
One thing that I've observed in doing these interviews, and it's been a real blessing to be able to ask some of these questions and hear some of the answers. I look at the work of Stuart Quo, founded Asian Americans Advancing Justice, Los Angeles.
Amazing man.
And I've known Dale for a number of years now, and have had an opportunity to speak at length with him, Don Tamaki, Michael G.W. Lee, and Karen Korematsu on Tuesday, and yesterday a interview with Daryl Davis, who's a African American blues musician who has inspired over 200 men to leave hate groups, particularly the KKK, is not just the spark of an idea or the emotion that drives that spark, but the longevity, because people face ups and downs as they do this work, even if it does occasionally spark joy. There are pragmatic barriers that come to play, and you have to push through them in order to make a real difference over time. And sometimes that pleases people, and sometimes it doesn't. But at those times, how have you been able to push through it and stay in the game for the period that you have?
As we were talking about earlier, this work is not easy work. Not everybody wants or thinks or believes that this is the right way to do things. It's getting a little easier as we move into the later years, but at the very beginning of really pushing for diversity, not a lot of people believed that diversity and inclusion was important. There are a lot of setbacks, and there's still many battles that we have to go through. I find that as I get older, and I've said this many times, you can say probably whatever you want to say, you just say it in the nicest way possible. But there are times when you can't be nice about it, when you just have to say what you have to say and let the chips fall where they may. And I've learned with being burned many times, with putting my foot in my mouth many times, with failure many times, that you just sort of have to take a day to lick your wounds and to nurse your bruises, and then look up and say, okay, we've got a long-term journey. It is not just a war. I mean, it's not just a battle. It's going to be a war. And even yesterday, we were looking at the work that we've done over the last 10 to 15 years in different organizations and seeing what we've done and what we've created disappear and change, and thinking, how do we recover from this? Where do we take all the work that we've done in the last decade so that we can build it and make sure that it continues to impact the legal profession? Where do we change? What do we do? What can we do differently? Who are our new partners? And so it really takes going out there. I think one of the biggest strengths has been to build the relationships that you trust. And the older you get and the more work you do, you build relationships where you know that you can work with partners, and they start trusting what you do and what the teams can do. And so you revise, you change course, you get strength from others who believe the way that you do. You revise your strategic plans, you get new partnerships, and you think about ways that you can get to the same result with an alternative path. And you just don't give up. You get mad. Believe me, I get mad, and I sound off to people who I feel safe with. But I try to be as nice as possible in public, but sometimes that doesn't really happen. Sometimes, but I think what's really important, Charles, is that we have to be a voice at the table. I know you've talked to a lot of people who have been the only one in the room, who have been the only voice in the room to speak up. I've been in that situation many times. I think you've been in that situation. And you can't be silent. If something is being decided upon, or if something is being discussed, and you have a different perspective, that's why you're in the room, to be that voice for all of the people that you represent.
The questions that I'm asking really are questions that benefit from perspective. And you know, you've been doing this work for what, 25 years now? 30 years? I mean, you've gone through a lot of these battles, and you've seen the cultural tide shift. Well, let me ask you about that, Ruthe. My leadership professor in graduate school talked about those battle scars too. He called those the scars of leadership. And you've talked about having to lick your wounds and tend to your bruises. How does a leader do that so that one can have the endurance over time?
You just fail. You fail a lot, and you grow a thicker skin with each time, and you learn from each time that you fail. I don't think anyone becomes a leader without a lot of failure in their background and learning how to deal with that failure. And I like to envision it to a phoenix rising out of the ashes. Yes, they can beat you down. Yes, you can think you have lost everything. And yes, you do need to take that time to just recover. But someone who really is passionate and committed to the work that they do and to the mission that they have will rise above and continue on. And I think leadership happens naturally without people saying, I'm going to be a leader. You have to learn the skills of leadership, but it's finding something you're really passionate about and then just doing it and getting involved. And when you find that one thing that you can put your heart and soul into it, it just kind of happens naturally. Yes, I think leadership academies and leadership skills are important. Communication, learning how to communicate without putting your foot in your mouth every time you open your mouth, that's important. But that happens with age, and that happens with experience. And when you get to my end, where you're looking back at your career, it doesn't mean you're perfect. You're still far from perfect. But you're still open to learning, and you make sometimes a fewer mistakes. But you still make mistakes, and you just rise above. So I think everyone who gets to this point, I mean, you look at Dale Manami, and and the kinds of things that he has had to overcome and battle through, and here he is being the icon of the civil rights community for the Asian Pacific American community. I heard about him when I was a law student, and shortly after I graduated from McGeorge, he and Fred Korematsu were presented with honorary degrees, and I got to host them for a day. Tell you, I was on cloud 9 that whole day, thinking I was in the presence of greatness. My first role model was Joyce Kennard. She had just been appointed as the first Asian Pacific American woman to the Supreme Court of California. And she was the one person who I saw that I could be like and relate to. I called her up and I said, Joyce, can I have lunch with you? I would love to just pick your brain. And that's what we hope we do as we move in our careers, is we inspire the people behind us, both young men and young women, to aspire to leadership and to be able to look at me and Dale and Judge Fougier and others and say, if they did it, I can do it too. That's what I did with Claire Huxtable. Just one visual in a half an hour, 5 minutes of that show where she was talking about a case she had in court changed my entire life. So visuals are important, role models are important, trailblazers are important, and just kind of powering through and learning from your mistakes. And believe me, there have been many. So you just kind of do it. And then you get to the end and you go, oh, wow, look where I am now. When did I get here?
You and I, we have a mutual friend who passed recently, 2 Fridays ago, Jeff Adachi, the elected public defender of San Francisco. And his passing made me, reflect on, illness and loss, including some, that I've experienced in my family. One question that sparks for me is what makes for a meaningful life. And I've observed you exercising what I think that is for you, but if you'd allow me to ask that question to you, what makes for a meaningful life?
I think for me it's service. And it's really giving back, which gives me joy. In the end, it's a very circular kind of thing. But the more I give, the more I get back. And I have been so lucky to have a family and a husband that's been very, very supportive of who I am and what I do. But I've also been very lucky in finding the sweet spot. I call it the sweet spot of work that is fulfilling and passionate for me, and a mission that has become that. I think everybody needs to find that sweet spot in their life and in their work and in their career that brings you joy, but at the same time gives back in ways that you never know into your community and to your colleagues.
One thing that didn't really occur to me on a emotional level until I had my daughter was how natural and human it is to want to teach someone who's younger than you. And I observe from a lot of the people that I admire that they mentor, that they find satisfaction in mentorship, mentoring that younger generation. And I know you've mentored hundreds of law students and lawyers. And if you imagine, that this audience is perhaps thousands of people that you could send a message to, is there anything in particular that you would like to say, imagining that they are your mentees?
Yes, and this is what I tell all my students, who I absolutely love, every single one of them. And I think that's the ingredient that we've got between me and my mentees, is a lot of caring and a lot of love. But I would say, find your passion, find your dream, and then do anything that you can to fulfill it.
Thank you, Ruthe.
Thank you, Charles.
That was wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah,
I think this is just a fabulous project.